So, Anand, let's talk about the interview. We combed through a lot of it in our last hour, seeing some fresh sound bites there today. But just in this hour, going at some of the issues on which she has held different positions. Last hour, we talked in some detail about fracking. She's saying very clearly, no, I'm not going to ban fracking. I said that as the vice presidential nominee in 2020. I'm saying it now as the Democratic nominee for president. We're not going to ban fracking, despite what I said in 2019 during my own primary campaign. Now talking about immigration, that she does not want to decriminalize illegal immigration. So what did you make of that as a voter, an independent voter who is sitting there saying, which version of Vice President Harris should I believe? The one in front of me now, or the one who was in the Senate and the one who ran for president in 2019? What she's saying effectively is, believe what I'm saying now. Does she make a convincing case?
Yeah, I think she did. And I think sometimes we're not honest with ourselves about, a couple things. First of all, we change our minds all the time based on information, based on where we're sitting, based on whether we're a junior person at the office or the person running the office. And it's actually normal. We should normalize changing your mind. I think sometimes we in journalism shame people kind of figuring out a different view that they might hold and call it flip-flopping and try to kind of catch people in it, when in some ways, on some issues, that's a measure of progress. I think we also need to recognize that she is in a different context right now than she was in a 2020 Democratic primary. She's in a general election against an American fascist, Donald Trump. And, let's just be real. Like, you need to sometimes do different things in a general election against a far right candidate than you do in a primary. Like, I don't think we can kind of pretend that's not the case. I think she said something by way of explanation of that actually was quite interesting and moving and goes beyond the familiar kind of tacking to the center. She talked about this notion of consensus when she was kind of pressed on this idea of reversal. And she said, I believe we have to work toward a consensus of how we can solve these things. And I think that kind of allows you to square the circle, which is to say, and this is true for a lot of liberals, in American life, where I think a lot of liberals who would distinguish themselves from progressives actually share progressive ideals in a certain form, share a certain notion of what immigration should be like. Don't think the way the right does about it. Share certain notions about preferring people to have health care to not having health care. Where liberals and progressives often differ is like their sense of how much power they're willing to smash to do it, where they think other people are. And so she talked about, look, I've expressed some of these ideals, but we have to be mindful, particularly in the position she's in now, of where other people are, where the country is, what can a large majority of people be led to want and be led to fight for. And I think that's a reasonable position to take, even if it's not, the same as my position on any given issue.
And so, Anand, you're right that the underlying message of let's turn the page, we're not going back, is that the stakes are so high that we cannot return to the years of Donald Trump. That's a position and something she said very explicitly in that interview yesterday. We showed some of Donald Trump's reaction, making very plain to the American public how different these two are, just visually. Watching Vice President Harris give an interview, talk coherently about policy, whether you agree or not, and also to have sort of just an affect, a more calming affect than the chaos that comes with Donald Trump. How important, how powerful is that contrast?
When I was watching last night and then just the clips that you were showing, three things struck me. First of all, these are people with heart, right? They're just like people who, I'm not saying they're off the chart. I'm saying they're just normal people who feel things for other people, who feel proud when their son loves them, and these things shouldn't be exceptional in American life. But when you're running against Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, being people with a heart is a really big contrast. Second, these are people who know a lot about stuff, to use a big word. These, just going into the weeds. If anything, Kamala Harris errs on the side of being very intricate in discussing some of these issues, in a non-soundbitey way. And gosh, what a relief to have someone whose sin sometimes is knowing too much about issues when she's up against a kind of babbling fascist. And finally, these are, to contrast with Tim Walz's favorite word, these are just normal people who I think are showing themselves to be normal. And so what all that amounts to me, the word I wrote down as I was sitting here waiting to come on is anti-inflammatory. I think this kind of notion of the last decade that the vice president was talking about, it's been an inflammatory decade. Not just Donald Trump, but the culture in general has been an inflammatory culture, right? And inflammation, it's not just something getting better. Like, inflammation is what kills our bodies, right? A lot of things inflame us, and there's some things that are kind of anti-inflammatory. Our politics has been a politics of inflammation, of constant warfare, of everything dramatized, even within our parties, even within the internecine splits. And I think this ticket, in many ways, is an anti-inflammatory ticket, downplaying kind of the personal issues of identity and gender that, that while significant, can be inflammatory, downplaying these kind of fights within progressives and moderates, and frankly, talking down Trump as kind of tired and weird and just past his prime, rather than, again, inflaming him into this strongman monster, which in some ways can be counterproductive, as we know. So I think we're seeing the politics of anti-inflammation, and after a very inflammatory decade, I think a lot of Americans are going to be drawn to it.
Yeah, to an exhausted American voting public, a turning of the page might feel pretty good right now. Vice President Harris wrapped up her bus tour of Georgia with a rally in Savannah last night. Nearly every seat taken in the arena, about 9,000 people in attendance there. Harris is the first presidential candidate to campaign in Savannah since Bill Clinton did in 1992, underscoring just how vital the campaign views Georgia and how in play it now is. Harris praised voters there for electing 2 Democrats to the United States Senate in 2020 and for helping to secure a win for the Biden-Harris ticket 4 years ago.
Georgia, for the past 2 election cycles, voters in this very state, you who are here, have delivered. You sent 2 extraordinary senators to Washington, D.C. You sent President Biden and me to the White House. You showed up. You knocked on doors. You registered folks to vote. And you made it happen. You did that. You did that. And so now we are asking you to do it again.
Tia Mitchell, you know Georgia so well, covering it with the AJC. We're reminded, of course, of the 2020 election. We can't forget, because Donald Trump, on that infamous phone call with Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger, reminds us every time we hear it that the vote was under 12,000 in 2020. It was a state that the Biden campaign had worried may be out of play this year. But now that the Harris campaign has brought back into play, what does it tell you that the campaign is spending so much time in Georgia?
Well, I think it tells us 2 things. Number one, I think it tells us that the campaign's, internal polling indicates that Georgia is still winnable. Otherwise, they wouldn't be spending so many resources in the state. But it also shows us that it's an important state for both campaigns. And the more that Harris campaigns in Georgia, the more she forces Donald Trump to spend money and resources on Georgia. And the more that Trump spends resources on Georgia, the less he has to spend in other battleground states. So it's a strategic move for Georgia, but I do think Harris would love to carry the state again.
It is striking to think that with Joe Biden at the top of the ticket after the debate, the Trump campaign was thinking, Tia, just how high it could run up the score, how many states it could grab, that it had Georgia and Arizona and Nevada in the bag, and maybe they're going to go win Minnesota, and they're talking about New Jersey and all this. And now, as you point out rightly, playing defense in a lot of places that they didn't think they'd have to. So as you cover the state of Georgia, what will be important? Obviously, the turnout in Atlanta, suburban voters around Atlanta going toward Kamala Harris, perhaps some of the women who like what they hear from her. What do you think will be decisive in Georgia come Election Day?
Yeah, a lot of the things you just mentioned, but I think the fact that the bus tour focused on South Georgia tells us a lot and is and is kind of illuminating of the Georgia electorate. Yes, South Georgia is pretty rural. It's very conservative, but rural Georgia means 25% black. Those are Democratic voters. And quite frankly, there are still some blue dog Democrats in rural South Georgia. So there are votes, even in those rural pockets, not necessarily a majority of the votes. Those are still, conservative counties. But of course, you win the Electoral College by the popular vote in each state. So the Harris campaign is saying, hey, we're going to go everywhere we can to get every vote that we can, because, yes, most of our votes are going to come from Atlanta, Metro Atlanta, the Atlanta suburbs. But if we can run up the score, if we can lose by less, so to speak, in South Georgia and other rural parts of the state, perhaps we can put together a win in 2024 and get those 16 electoral votes.
Yeah, it's such a good point. This was not just a tour of Atlanta and DeKalb and Cobb counties that we've come to see from Democrats. They're working South Georgia. Washington correspondent for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Tia Mitchell, thanks so much for your insights. We appreciate it.